Working the night shift at Starbucks always seemed pretty chill to me. Few customers, a quiet environment, and honestly, I even enjoyed the solitude. But that night, something happened that completely changed the way I see this place. It was around 11:30. The weather outside was strange, the kind of night that gives you chills for no reason. The wind was blowing hard, making the leaves on the trees rattle against the windows as if they were trying to get in. The streetlights flickered occasionally, which didn't help the growing sense of unease inside me. I was behind the counter, cleaning the coffee machine, when I heard the door open. The sound was soft, almost as if someone had passed through it without actually pushing it. I looked up and saw a man walk in. He had a presence that chilled me to the bone. Tall, dressed in an impeccable black suit that seemed to absorb all the light around him. He wore a hat that partially covered his face, but even so, I could tell he wasn't a regular customer. The sound of his footsteps on the ceramic floor was almost imperceptible, as if he was floating. When he approached the counter, the air around him felt colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees just because he was there. He leaned slightly forward and, with a low, drawn-out voice, said, "An espresso, please." There was no emotion in his voice, no trace of fatigue, excitement, or anything I could identify as human. It was almost mechanical, like he had repeated that phrase hundreds of times. I hesitated for a second but quickly started preparing his order. My movements were slower than usual, not because I wanted them to be, but because something in the air made me feel like I was in slow motion. Every sound the machine made seemed to echo strangely in the silence of that night. As I was making the coffee, I could feel his eyes fixed on me. That feeling of being watched sent shivers down my spine. When I finished, I placed the cup on the counter and slid it toward him. That's when he lifted his head a bit more, revealing his eyes. They were empty. I can't explain it, but it felt like something essential was missing, something that makes a person, a person. His gaze was cold and deep, like he was analyzing me, seeing something inside me that I didn't even know was there. He gave a slight smile, but it wasn't a normal smile. It felt more like a reflex than a genuine expression. He picked up the cup with a thin, pale hand, took a sip, and before I could ask if he wanted anything else, he just disappeared. I know, it sounds crazy, but that's how it happened. He was there 1 second, and the next, he was gone. I didn't hear the door open, I didn't hear footsteps, nothing. He just vanished. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. I looked around, searching for any sign that he might have left without me noticing, but the door was still locked. My heart started pounding faster. The only sound I could hear was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above me. I turned my attention back to the counter, where the espresso cup still sat. I walked over, picked up the cup, and when I looked inside, I saw that the coffee was frozen. It wasn't lukewarm or cold, it was frozen, with a layer of ice covering the surface, like it had come straight out of a freezer. I dropped the cup back on the counter, my hands shaking. The only thought running through my mind was, what the hell just happened? I was terrified, but at the same time, a morbid curiosity made me want to understand what that was. Since that night, I can't work the night shift without constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time I make an espresso, I get that chill again, as if he's there, watching me. And every time the door opens and the bell rings, I keep expecting it to be him, coming back to finish the coffee he never really drank.
Working the night shift at Starbucks was usually a pretty calm routine. Not many people came by after 10, and I was used to being alone, with the soft background music playing and the constant smell of fresh coffee in the air. But that night, everything felt different, in a way I couldn't quite explain. Outside, the weather was strange. Heavy clouds covered the sky, as if they had swallowed the stars and the moon. It wasn't raining, but the air was humid, almost sticky, and a cold wind blew occasionally, making the trees sway in a way that reminded me of bony fingers trying to reach something. The empty parking lot was lit only by the streetlights, which flickered from time to time, casting distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Inside the store, everything was in its usual place. The small wooden tables with their chairs pushed in, the counters clean and organized, the coffee machine releasing that steam that slowly spread through the air. I had just finished cleaning the coffee machine and was putting away the cups when I heard a noise coming from the storage room. It was a dull sound, like a box had fallen to the floor. The storage room was small and located at the back of the store, an area where the light was dimmer, and the walls seemed to absorb sound, muffling any noise that came from there. I knew there was no one else in the store, so that noise made me freeze immediately. I stood there, motionless, trying to hear anything else, but everything went back to silence. I grabbed the flashlight that was kept under the counter and started walking toward the storage room. The sound of my footsteps on the ceramic floor echoed strangely, as if the place was too empty. When I reached the storage room door, I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The doorknob was cold to the touch, cold in a way that didn't make sense, considering the air inside the store wasn't chilly. I opened the door slowly, and the darkness inside seemed thicker than usual, as if the light from the hallway couldn't penetrate it properly. I turned on the flashlight, but it flickered a few times before completely going out, leaving me in total darkness. I cursed under my breath and hit the flashlight, trying to make it work again, but nothing happened. Even without light, I decided to go in. The storage room had several metal shelves, full of boxes of cups, bags of coffee, and other supplies we use daily. The air in there felt heavier, almost suffocating, and each step I took made a muffled sound, as if the floor was absorbing the impact. I started looking for the fallen box, but everything seemed to be in place. The shelves were aligned, the boxes neatly stacked, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I heard the sound again, but this time, it was different. It was a whisper. Low, almost imperceptible, but there. It seemed to come from behind the shelves, from a dark corner where the flashlight couldn't reach. My heart started beating faster. The whisper continued, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. It sounded like a voice, or maybe several, mixed into a continuous murmur that sent chills down my spine. I took another step toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, moving too quickly to be human. It was as if there was something there, something that shouldn't be. My body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, I just stood there, watching that shadow that seemed to twist and move in an impossible way. Then, as if it realized I was there, the shadow disappeared, vanishing into the heavy air of the storage room. I didn't think twice. I turned and ran out of there, slammed the storage room door shut, and went back to the counter, my heart pounding in my chest. My breathing was fast, and I felt sweat dripping down my forehead, despite the cold that still seemed to surround me. When I got back to the counter, the flashlight turned on again, as if nothing had happened. But the strangest thing was yet to come. I looked at the computer where we logged the orders, and on the screen, in red letters, it said, "I'm still here." The words pulsed on the screen, almost as if they were alive. My whole body was trembling, and I knew that couldn't be real. I blinked a few times, but the words remained there, glowing in a sinister red that seemed to cut through the air. I turned off the computer and just stood there, at the counter, not knowing what to do, not knowing if I was going crazy or if there really was something in the storage room. Since that night, I avoid going near that door. When I'm on the night shift, I always make sure the storage room is locked, and I don't go in there, no matter what. Because I know, whatever was in there, it's still waiting. And I'm not willing to find out what it is.
Working the night shift at Starbucks was never exactly what I'd call a dream job, but for some reason, I liked the peace that the night brought. It was a sense of isolation that, most of the time, put me at ease. However, on that particular night, I would have given anything not to feel that loneliness. It was a winter night, one of those where the wind seems to cut through any layer of clothing you're wearing. The sky was covered with heavy clouds, and the forecast said it would start snowing any minute. Inside, the store was warm, with the familiar smell of fresh coffee and baking pastries, but something in the air made me uncomfortable. You know when you feel like something is out of place? even if you don't know what it is. It was a little after midnight, and the store was completely empty. I had already cleaned all the tables, organized the cups, and now I just had to wait for closing time. The background music was playing softly, a gentle melody that, instead of calming me, seemed to heighten the feeling of unease. Then the door opened. The bell above it rang, echoing through the empty store. I looked up, expecting to see a lost customer or maybe a homeless person seeking warmth, but what I saw made me freeze inside. It was a woman. She had a strange look about her, an appearance that seemed to belong to another era. She wore a long black dress and a hat that covered half of her face. Her hair was dark and fell in loose, wet curls, as if she had just come in from a storm. But the strangest thing was that, despite the cold outside, she didn't seem to be freezing. She walked in slowly, without making a sound, and went straight to a table in the darkest corner of the store, the one where the light never seemed to reach properly. When she sat down, the air around her seemed to grow colder. I stood behind the counter, unsure whether I should go over there or wait for her to come and place an order. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the shiver running down my spine, and walked over to the table. "Good evening. Can I take your order?" My voice came out a bit shaky, and I cursed myself mentally for sounding so nervous. She slowly lifted her head, and when I finally saw her face, my heart nearly stopped. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark and sunken, with a gleam I couldn't quite place. She smiled a slow, joyless smile, as if she found my fear amusing. "A black coffee, no sugar," she said, her voice almost a whisper but clear enough to echo in my mind. I quickly nodded and went back to the counter, trying to ignore the feeling that her eyes were still on me. I started preparing the coffee, but my hands were shaking, and the sound of the coffee machine seemed louder than usual, almost deafening. When I finally finished, I placed the cup on a tray and returned to her table. The store seemed darker, as if the lights were losing strength. I set the cup down in front of her, and when I looked up, she was staring at me with that same empty smile. "Here you go, ma'am." My voice was lower than I intended, almost a whisper, as if something was tightening around my throat. She didn't respond, just kept staring at me as she brought the cup to her lips. Time seemed to stop, and the ticking of the clock on the wall became the only sound I could hear, each tick echoing in my head like a hammer. I slowly backed away, feeling my whole body tense with fear. I returned to the counter, trying to focus on anything other than the fact that the woman was still there, in the dark corner of the store, watching me. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. I glanced over at her several times, but every time I did, I felt a chill, as if something was draining the life from the space around her. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing second, and the steam rising from her coffee started to condense, forming a thin layer of frost on the rim of the cup. Finally, I looked at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m., time to close the store. I gathered my courage and walked back to the table. "Sorry, ma'am, but we're about to close," I said, trying to sound firm, but the nervousness was still evident in my voice. She lifted her head, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't going to respond. But then she spoke with the same soft, icy voice. "Time never stops, but for some things, it has already ended." I stood there, unsure of how to respond. Those words didn't make sense, but the way she said them, as if there was a weight behind them, left me even more unsettled. The woman walked past me toward the door, and as she left, the bell rang again, but this time, the sound was muffled, as if coming from far away. I stood there, watching the door close slowly, and only after a few minutes was I able to move. I went back to the table where she had been sitting, carefully picked up the cup, and then her words echoed in my mind. "Time never stops, but for some things it has already ended." I quickly cleaned the table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something very strange and dark had just happened. I closed the store as fast as I could and went home, but the image of that woman, with her empty eyes and unsettling smile, never left my mind. Even now, when I pass by Starbucks at night, I feel a chill, as if something is watching me. I never worked that shift again, but I still find myself thinking about her, about those cryptic words. And the most disturbing part is that on nights like that, I feel like time somehow really did stop at that moment. I had just closed the register and was waiting for the time to go home. The store was empty, but a thick fog covered everything outside. I could barely see the street. Everything was too quiet, just the sound of the coffee machine in the background, and it was making me nervous as I stood there in Starbucks, staring at the clock that seemed to have stopped. The night shift was never easy, but on that specific night, it felt like time was dragging on purpose. The lights outside barely penetrated the glass due to the fog that night, and only a few people passed by on the sidewalk. I had already cleaned the tables about 3 times, just to have something to do. The chairs were perfectly aligned, the cups neatly organized, and the floor was sparkling clean. Everything was in order, but there were still 2 hours left before I could close the store. That's when I noticed something strange. I was arranging the shelves when I felt that chill on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. You know that weird feeling that something is wrong, but you can't quite figure out what it is? I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. The store was empty, as it had been since my last customer left, a lady in a hurry who just grabbed a coffee to go. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a tap on the window. I looked outside and saw a figure, blurred by the fog, just standing there, staring at me. I thought it was a lost customer, but when I went to the window, there was no one there. But as soon as I turned my back, I heard the tap again, louder. I looked back, and this time, the figure was closer, almost pressing its face against the glass. I couldn't see the face, just the silhouette, but something was off. Like the head didn't have the right shape, you know? It seemed distorted. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or even the reflection of something inside the store. I went back to the counter, tried to get back into the rhythm, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. The ambient music, which usually calmed me, now felt more unsettling, almost disturbing. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. I approached the window and looked, not just at the glass, but at its reflection. And that's when it appeared again. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I ran to turn on the outside lights, but they didn't come on. Everything was dark. When I looked at the window again, the figure had disappeared, but the handprints remained on the glass, as if someone had pressed them hard against it. I stood there, paralyzed, until my coworker arrived to replace me. He said I looked pale and asked what had happened. I could only point to the window. When he looked, the marks were gone. Since that night, I can't get the image of that figure in the fog out of my head, and every time I see the window, I feel like it's still there, just waiting to appear again.